to Tysky Sour in my new undecorated flat. Now, I haven't done it from home. I'm not doing the show tonight from home purely because I want to show you my beige walls. I think I'm going to change the colour. But because we are extra cautious at Novara Media. And it turns out, to be honest, I hadn't read the full document, but it turns out that if you are ill in any way at all, you're not supposed to go into the studio. Very good policy. I have a mild cold. I'm pretty sure it's not coronavirus, but it's always better to be on the safe side. Better to be safe than sorry. Also from her own... Are you from your bedroom, Dalia?
I am in my own bedroom.
Where are you speaking to me from?
Yeah, and amazing. This time without connection issues, hopefully.
Yeah, you seem very clear to me. Now, I wanted to start because I have a bit of a moral dilemma, and I think this must be something which is afflicting so many people in the country right now, which is you have mild cold symptoms. Well, I have mild cold symptoms, sore throat. And so people are, oh, you should get a test. But then you look on the website to get a test, and you have to tick the thing that says you've got either a fever, a persistent cough, or you've lost your taste, your sense of taste and smell, or it's changed significantly. And my mouth doesn't taste amazing, but I feel like that's kind of base level cold anyway. And so what do you do? I mean, the reason they say that is because the testing system is bursting at the seams. They can't have people just getting tested when they've got a common cold. But at the same time, I'm like, maybe it's the taste smell thing that I'm like, maybe it's borderline.
Well, this is the issue, isn't it? Is that, if I woke up one day and I lost my sense of smell and taste, I pretty much know I wouldn't really bother getting a test. It's when you're in that weird in between bit where you're not sure. And that's where, you're really, or you think you were exposed, but you're not sure, but you could be asymptomatic. Those are the people that are really the risky carriers and the people who can spread. But I will tell you that a little insight into the development of the testing system. My housemate actually ordered a coronavirus test because he also was in a similar position where he was sort of not sure. And he was like, okay, it's better to be safe than sorry. And he received a bread making kit and glass Tupperwares and a bag of protein powder instead.
No.
I swear on my life.
Wow, well, that's sort of changed. That's changed the perspective
so
now.
Maybe there's no bloody point.
Well, I'd quite like all three of those things, to be honest. Glass Tupperware, that's high grade.
I know, we opened it. We were just like, who would say, because at first we thought, maybe it's a gift. We were like, who would send this? And also it was just, basically, we know for certain that it was meant to be the tests because he got a text saying, oh, we sent your test. They were delivered at X PM on this day. And that's exactly when this package arrived. So, big up the British state. Strong and stable.
I think what I'm going to do, I've sort of decided it just during this intro, is I'm going to, not really go out, wait until tomorrow morning. If my taste and smell is still there, probably assume I'm fine. Anyway, we've got so much to talk about tonight. I can't just tell you about my current situation. That's not what this show is about. And there are huge political rumblings going on at the moment. So Boris Johnson, as you all know, should be focusing on coronavirus spiraling out of control in this country. Immediate urgent action is needed. But instead of doing, the simple things that could make our lives all a little bit easier and save a lot of lives, Boris Johnson has decided to pick two rather unnecessary fights. So one is with mayors in the north of England, particularly Andy Burnham. That's because Rishi Sunak is not forthcoming with the required economic support to make local lockdowns an attractive thing to do. Well, it's never attractive, is it? But make it seem like a reasonable thing to do. At the same time, he's getting all macho man with the European Union, saying he's going to walk out with no deal or walk away from negotiations, even though we've now passed the deadline he set himself. Anyway, so much to talk about on the show. Before we get started, you know what to do. Share the show link, tweet on the hashtag #TyskySour. We'll go to your comments throughout the show. First story. As more regions of the UK enter local lockdowns, there is a continued standoff between Boris Johnson and Greater Manchester Metro Mayor Andy Burnham. Burnham is holding out for more economic support before agreeing Greater Manchester should enter into tier 3 of our lockdown systems, which would mean that, amongst other things, all pubs and bars would be closed. Boris Johnson this afternoon had this to say.
I'd much rather that we were able to do things with the help support the leadership of local authorities. And I pay tribute to Liverpool City region, to Lancashire that came on board today with the tiering system. In London, you've seen the mayor come on board as well. And that's very, very important because clearly, if you're going to enforce these measures, if you're going to do proper local testing and tracing, if you're going to get a local buy-in and compliance, then local leadership is crucial. And we want to work with local leaders. But, I have to say, Paul, concerned about what's happening in Manchester, where clearly the levels of infection are rising steeply, the levels of hospitalisation are rising steeply, and we do need to see action. And you say I'd much rather not impose things. I'd much rather that we were able to work out something together with local authorities, with the mayor in Manchester. But it's up to local leaders to show the kind of leadership that we've seen in Liverpool, in Lancashire, and in London.
So that was Boris Johnson suggesting that Andy Burnham should show some leadership. The implication being that, the virus is quite out of control in the northwest. New measures do need to be taken, and Andy Burnham should stand up there and say, this is the right thing to do. So, so do it. You guys should stay at home. We're going to enter into a tier-free lockdown and accept the inevitable. The problem with that is that Andy Burnham's demands have been very reasonable. It's not Andy Burnham who is stopping Manchester and the northwest going into a tier-free lockdown. It is the government. And in particular, actually, it's Rishi Sunak who is refusing to accede to very reasonable demands for example, have an 80% furlough scheme as we had for the first part of the year. We're going to show you Andy Burnham yesterday, and I think the thing to keep in mind here is Boris Johnson is saying this man is not showing leadership. Now, you take a look at this clip and make your own assessment as to whether Andy Burnham, in his intervention on the steps of Manchester Town Hall yesterday, was showing the kind of leadership you want to see from leaders in this country.
The government is not giving city regions like ours and the Liverpool city region the necessary financial backing for full lockdowns of that kind. That is why we have unanimously opposed the government's plans for Tier 3. They are flawed and unfair. They are asking us to gamble our residents' jobs, homes and businesses and a large chunk of our economy on a strategy that their own experts tell them might not work. We would never sign up for that. While this is not necessarily Greater Manchester's view, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer also told us last night that the only certain thing to work is a national lockdown. But the government told us this morning it is unwilling to do that because of the damage it will do to the national economy. And yet, that is what they want to impose on the North West. So that was our conclusion from the number 10 meeting this morning. They are willing to sacrifice jobs and businesses here to try and save them elsewhere. Greater Manchester, the Liverpool City region and Lancashire are being set up as the canaries in the coal mine for an experimental regional lockdown strategy as an attempt to prevent the expense of what is truly needed. The very least they should be offering the people of Greater Manchester who will be affected by these closures is a full and fair 80% furlough scheme for all affected workers, 80% income support for people who are self-employed, and a proper compensation scheme for businesses. So far, they have not been prepared to offer that.
Now, to my mind, they are all very reasonable demands. Rishi Sunak still hasn't actually offered any explanation as to why workers who are unable to work during this lockdown should only get 2/3 of their income, whereas in the first lockdown, people got 80%. It doesn't make any sense. I can't see any justification whatsoever. Sort of in a separate part of that speech and in the question and answers, actually, I think Andy Burnham also made like a very important point, which is to say that we brought the country into a lockdown when cases were very high in London, but quite low in the northwest. We didn't just have a London lockdown back in March, we had a lockdown across the whole country. Now we're in a situation where cases are high in the northwest and they're rising in London, but they're not that high. And suddenly a nationwide lockdown is something that's completely unacceptable. So you can see why people think that the northwest is getting, a dud deal in this particular situation. But, and this is a big but, this system obviously can't go on. Andy Burnham is, using the only leverage he has and all power to him. But at the same time, every weekend and every day that goes by where Manchester doesn't have further restrictions is a day where more people are going to catch coronavirus. Something somewhere is going to have to give. What will happen next? That's going to be something we'll see over the weekend and probably in the first part of next week. But will we have a clue? Do we already have a clue in what's gone on in Lancashire? So today, Lancashire agreed to enter into a tier 3 lockdown in exchange for £42 million in discretionary funding. There is no return to the 80% furlough scheme, which is what Burnham is asking. Now, this isn't a perfect comparison because the leader of Lancashire County Council is a Conservative. It was him who was making the agreement. But Lancashire does contain many Labour towns. One of them is Preston. And I spoke earlier today to the leader of Preston Council, Matthew Brown. I started by asking whether he himself had consented to Preston entering a tier 3 lockdown.
I was kind of left with no choice, to be honest. There was a number of us that were actually holding out, trying to stand in solidarity with Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester and also the North East and Yorkshire as well, especially for the 80% furlough rate. But it got to a situation where they were basically saying it will be imposed and that if Preston or South Ribble or whoever it is actually aren't part of this, the restrictions will be even heavier. So that would have meant that people wouldn't have been able to travel outside of Preston and stop overnight in Lancashire, even the county. It would have meant also the businesses that were currently excluded, like restaurants and gyms, they would have not been in the exclusion. They would have not actually, they'd have been closed and open in other parts of Lancashire. And the extra money we've got, which is nowhere near enough, that would have been taken away as well. So they made that quite clear towards the end. So I was left in a situation, and one or two others were, that, I had to accept that in the sense that that's what was coming if we didn't agree to it. So it's a form of bullying in the sense that, those who dissented a bit were actually marginalised. And, it's like, very little parameters of actually what can actually be agreed. There was no real negotiation. It's like they decided it from day one, really.
And I mean, the decision now has been taken out of your hands, but there's still a standoff going on between Greater Manchester and London. And I wanted your thoughts on kind of, I suppose, the high stakes involved in this, because I mean, most of our viewers, I think, will be they'll be Andy Burnham's side, basically. I believe that workers definitely deserve 80%, or I'd give them 100%, but whatever, 80%, a full furlough, not the 2/3. But at the same time, by holding out, every day you hold out, every day you have looser restrictions than are what the scientists are demanding, that could potentially be costing lives. So I wanted to get sort of your thoughts on, that tension that exists there.
No, you're right, and it's something that I've been thinking about all the time. Many sleepless nights in the last week, just it going through my head. And they can, if they want, support us at the levels that will actually protect people and protect communities, but they're choosing not to do. And I don't feel guilty at all, because we've been asking for taking control of the test and trace system in Lancashire, and I've been asking for that specifically. We've been asking for more money, more measures, and they've only come to us late, really. And yes, we need to move really quickly, but the reality is that potentially we're going to get a mental health epidemic in our communities, and potentially there might be risks of suicide in communities as well. So, they put us in a situation which is really, really unfair and quite brutal, in the sense that they've not genuinely negotiated. They negotiated in such a way that they said it's going to happen anyway, and you can either have it on slightly more favourable terms than what's really bad, or really bad. So that's the situation we've been in, really. So it's been very difficult, and everyone wants to make sure that we actually control this virus, but we can't do it at the expense of the local economy, and especially plunging many people into poverty in the community.
So that was Matthew Brown, leader of Preston Council, also does some incredible work on community wealth building, which I'm sure we'll talk about on a future show. But for now, that was, really It's really horrible, actually, the way, a gun is being held to local leaders' heads who are just looking for a good and fair deal for the citizens who live in their communities. Dalia, I want your thoughts on this. I suppose one, in terms of the moral dilemma, the horrible moral dilemma that's been placed on the heads of leaders in the north of England, but also what the hell are the government thinking? I mean, for me, this just seems like such an unnecessary fight. The figures that are involved in the difference between having a 66% furlough or an 80% furlough, they're not that big, and so much money has already been spent. Why are the Conservatives picking this fight?
Well, you're completely right. I mean, they have put these local mayors in a really difficult position because, as sort of was laid out there, you have the kind of the choice between letting this pandemic go on without really going into the kind of lockdown that is necessary, or you have the severe implications of people only having access to 2/3 of their wages. I mean, we all know that you don't have 1/3 of your wage every month to spare. That's not the reality for most people. But also the key thing that I think was picked up in that interview that was really interesting to me was that, and we mentioned this last week, that continually locking down every time infections get high is not, or like waiting for infections to get really, really high and then locking down is not a sustainable strategy, especially because we know that this virus is going to be with us for a while. The point that was raised there is also the lack of any kind of track and trace system, of infrastructures that could allow us to not have to take such dramatic measures that have such dramatic impacts on people's lives. And that is something that could be done regionally and could be done locally if local government was actually resourced to do it, but it's simply not. And as was mentioned, there is a choice made not to. The reason that the government are picking this battle, I think, and it reminds me very much of how throughout austerity, big decisions are made by people who not only never have to face the consequences of it, but don't even see the consequences of it. They aren't in those primary sort of sites of care where you really see the impacts of austerity on your community. But the reason they're picking this fight is because, as we've sort of mentioned throughout, that they are trying to, and it's good to see local leaders pushing back against this. It's this attempt to avoid reality in order to keep this harmful fiction that we can continue endless growth in the middle of this pandemic. I walked past a card shop today. It was like kind of cards and trinkets and stuff. And it had this thing on this sign. It said, start buying stuff again or we're all screwed. And I was like, what a perfect manifestation of how dysfunctional our economy is, that in the middle of a pandemic, our road to recovery is based on people buying enough unicorn-shaped coffee mugs and therefore having to go to work and put themselves at risk in order to get the wage to do so. But I wonder if, and James Medway mentioned this last week, I wonder if sort of as the Brexit crisis unfolds, as the corona crisis unfolds, we are going to see this kind of regional leadership more. It's quite rare for, this is not normal necessarily for sort of local mayors like this to be speaking on such a national platform and to be having this kind of national, like the struggle with the national government that is so prominent. But I wonder kind of as the ways of dealing with these crises become increasingly out of touch with people's everyday lives, that this kind of regionalization of politics is likely to become more commonplace.
I mean, I should also say it's not, I mean, I agree with all of that. I mean, it is going to be really interesting to see also how this plays out. Are we going to see sort of cities take on the same political role that, for example, the nations of the United Kingdom have? The way Andy Burnham is sort of, standing up to Boris Johnson reminds me a little bit of Nicola Sturgeon. But what I did want to make sure we mention is that it's not just the difference between the 80% furlough and the 2/3 furlough, which is the problem with what Rishi Sunak is currently offering regions which are going into local lockdowns. Because the problem with that policy, beyond it being less than 80% for no reason given, is that you can only apply to get that scheme if your business has been formally banned from opening. So if you are in one of those pubs or bars that doesn't serve enough food that it can remain open, and it's obviously not just those businesses that are going to be affected. So the suppliers for pubs and bars are also going to be affected, but obviously they can stay open. They can just stay open and no one wants to go there. It's also the case that even in tier 2, which London is going to be entering into from midnight tonight, you're going to have serious problems. And that's because even though restaurants and pubs and everything can formally stay open, which means that actually no one can access the 2/3 furlough, because people aren't allowed to meet people outside of their household indoors, then who's going to go to a pub? Who's going to go to a restaurant? I mean, you could just go to a pub or a restaurant with the people who are within your own household. But I mean, in that situation, you might as well just eat at home. The reason you go to pubs and restaurants is to meet people who live outside of your household. So you're going to get massively depleted demand. You're going to get job losses. And, well, you're going to get a mountain of job losses if we don't have an extension of the furlough. And the whole thing is an absolute mess. One other sort of element of the mess here I wanted to bring up is that because the government are sort of agreeing these bespoke deals for different regions, every time they give something to one local government, another local government who didn't get that is incredibly pissed off. And a very clear example of this was today, where Lancashire got agreement that even though they're going into tier 3, gyms can remain open. And this inevitably pissed off Liverpool, who, when they went into tier 3, had gyms closed. I want to go to a tweet from Steve Rotherham, who is the mayor of the metro area of Liverpool. He tweets, "The tier system was meant to offer simplicity and uniformity. Instead, we're seeing a 2-tiered system of tiers emerge. How a gym uses it in our region more at risk than others. We were given no say in gym closures, but this is just wrong. We're demanding answers." And again, this is completely obvious. How did the government think that they could say, oh, you guys in Liverpool, you have to close your gyms, whereas you guys in Lancashire, you can keep them open? It undermines, as Steve Rotherham says there, the whole point of this tiered system, which was to give some uniformity, some simplicity, instead of just these weird-ass bespoke rules in every different town and city, which no one can follow and which doesn't seem to have any logic in forming it. It just makes the communication of this impossible, which from a public health perspective, as well as a fairness perspective, is an absolute disaster. I want to go to some of your comments. We've got 1,500 people watching. Let's get this to 2,000 tonight. You've got to share that link. And a tweet on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Angus Robertson: "I believe to be able to claim furlough, the business must pay an employee 80% wage with 67% claimed back." Oh, I'm not sure that's the case. Could be. I'll have to look that up. This will probably still lead to redundancies, as companies won't top up the amount on top of furlough. I think maybe they have to pay national insurance on the scheme that sort of Rishi Sunak announced. As far as I understand it, they don't have to pay any part of the wage, but I'll have to look into that. Why did Greg Goke at the start of the show gave us a £5. Give me something to smile about tonight, please, NM. I don't know what you thought we were going to talk about, but it is all the government being shit, because that is the main story of today. I don't think we have as far as I can remember, we don't have a sort of funny story at the end of tonight. But anyway, hopefully you're enjoying this. And JW with a £10 super chat. Can I get a birthday shout out from my good mate Dan, who introduced me to NM? Love the show. All the best from Glasgow. Of course, happy birthday, Dan. And you've done the right thing, which is you introduced your friends to Tysky Sour. If you're watching this and you haven't introduced any of your friends to Tysky Sour, what are you waiting for? Next story, which is kind of actually just an addendum to the previous story, which is we've spoken about the political rows that have erupted over the lockdown tiers. They are important, as we've said. It is absolutely right that the mayors in Northern England are taking this fight to the Tories. But there is one problem in this discussion, which is that nobody here is really asking for what the scientists have said is necessary. To be honest, actually, some of the Northern mayors are. Andy Burnham is saying let's have a circuit breaker lockdown. But under discussion, what's on the negotiating table isn't really what matters. What we might see over the next few weeks is, Manchester will go into this tier 3 lockdown. They might get a few financial incentives, which won't be enough. But even if all of that happens, it won't be enough. The scientists are saying we need much more urgent, much more extreme action, because we're in a very extreme situation. I want to show you a clip of John Edmonds, who's an epidemiologist on Sage. We've shown you clips of him before. He was asked this morning by Kay Burley on Sky what he thinks the government needs to do now.
Well, I think what we've got to do is two things. One, we've got to take a longer term view and we have to put some restrictions in place over the winter, unfortunately. And a package of restrictions are probably going to be required, and I would say they're probably going to be required across the country. I think a circuit breaker can help because it can reduce the reduce the prevalence. So there's two things. One, the sort of longer term package is to slow the growth rate, or hopefully to even reverse it perhaps. But, essentially that's what the reproduction number is. So you want to bring the reproduction number down to perhaps 1 or something like that. But if you have a high prevalence, then you're holding a reproduction number at 1 means that you're holding the prevalence at a high rate, or you're holding the rate of disease at a high level. So that is where the circuit breaker comes in to reduce the rate of disease, to bring it down. So you bring that down and then hold it at a lower level, and that's going to give us a much more safe winter, and maybe we won't be able, we will be able to continue. Health service will be able to continue to offering a full range of services to all of the people who need those.
No, I thought that was a very helpful explanation of what needs to happen in terms of distinguishing between getting prevalence down, which means getting down the number of people who have coronavirus in the country right now, and getting the R rate down, which is sort of controlling the spread of this. And this sort of clears up some of the confusion about the circuit breaker, because what a circuit breaker will do is it gets the prevalence down. It means that less people, after 2 weeks should hopefully have coronavirus in the country. But there's only a point in doing that if you can also introduce policies which keep the R rate down, which means that it seems at this point we are going to need to have some restrictions which apply to the whole country and which are semi-permanent, that last 6 months, not just a 2 week on, 2 week off thing. Whether that's going to be bars and pubs, I'm not sure. But something needs to happen, which isn't happening right now. It could also be a functioning test and trace system, which clearly we don't have. We'll get onto that a little bit more later. I suppose to just sort of demonstrate how far we are from the goals of having prevalence low and having the R rate down, the ONS today published their statistics, which are the gold standard of how many people in the country have coronavirus at any one time, even though there's a 2 week lag, which means it's probably higher than it was then. But their data released today showed that last week there were 27,000 new infections per day in England, which is 62% up from the previous week. So you can see the prevalence very high. Even if R was only at 1, we'd still be getting 27,000 new infections every day. But unfortunately, it's not at 1 because cases have gone up 62% in a week. Again, here, the solution doesn't need to be hard. What do you do here? One option is a circuit breaker which coincides with school holidays. And this was proposed today, or it was revealed today that this is what's being proposed by government advisors, is to say, instead of having this sort of manic, are we going to have a circuit breaker now? Are we going to do that? They said, why not just announce now that every time there's a school holiday, we're going to have a circuit breaker lockdown, which is going to give us a chance to sort of improve the systems we have in place. And if you plan it now, then that means that we can put that in our diaries, and we know that is a sort of safety valve for whatever happens over the coming months. Dalia, I want your thoughts on all of this. I suppose, given those ONS figures, sort of how far away are we from a response to coronavirus that approximates the urgency we're currently facing, and also this idea from government advisors that what we should see now is circuit breakers planned to coincide with school holidays, potentially making the half-term break 2 weeks instead of 1 week, and let's just put it in the diary now.
That is obviously one option, but I think the key question here, and especially because this is going to be a long-term issue for us, the key question to me is why we don't have enough tests to test asymptomatic people, why we don't have enough tests to test people who are exactly in your position where, they think they could have symptoms, but they're not quite sure. It's a bit ambiguous. And so, asking someone, and currently the government's policy is that if you feel like you could potentially have symptoms, or if you think you might have been exposed, or if your housemate's been exposed, that you should just isolate for 2 weeks. Well, that's a really big ask, especially when you're not providing people with the financial relief to isolate for 2 weeks. So what you'll just have is people will obviously make the decision to go to work, to go on public transport because they need to make a check. So really, for me, it's like, obviously these kind of strategies of having, for example, a lockdown penciled in the books is a good strategy. But like you said, it doesn't really work if you bring the prevalence down and then it just shoots straight back up again because you don't have an effective testing and tracing system. And this seems to be something that a a lot of other countries, particularly countries in Europe, have managed to do. And that is why, we are not seeing the scale that we are seeing, in particularly in places like Germany. And so my question is, and this really comes down to, and we'll be discussing this soon, this really comes down to the fact that we are seeing the politicizing of this crisis by the fact that the state is handing out contracts to companies that are clearly not up to the job. And so we are hemorrhaging money to these private companies who are paying massive dividends to their shareholders for failing the British public, and starving workers of the resources that they need to look after themselves and their families.
We're going to go to a clip in a moment from Boris Johnson today in the press conference. It was about 4 p.m. First of all, and it also actually, I'll have a very slightly different take to you on this, Dalia, because I think in terms of brute numbers of tests, the government is actually doing okay. I think that the problems with their strategy is slightly different. But let's take a look at Boris Johnson first.
We've already bought millions of these tests, some of which are very simple, meaning you simply need to wipe the swab inside your mouth and can give a result as quickly as in 15 minutes. Some of these fast tests work with saliva, and we're already using these in hospitals. We've started building the infrastructure for domestic manufacture of these tests, ensuring that Britain has the ability to produce millions of fast tests here. Over the next few weeks, we will start distributing and trialling these tests across the country. This will enable us to do quick turnaround tests on NHS and care home staff much more frequently. By testing more frequently and quickly than ever before, we can help prevent the spread of the virus spreading through care homes.
And so why I wanted to show that, and I suppose where I differ slightly on the testing numbers, is that the government they say they're doing kind of the most tests in Europe. I think they are, or at least they're close. They're doing quite a lot of tests. The problem is they aren't taking the simple public health measures that sort of makes any of this stuff matter in terms of controlling a virus. So for example, Italy, you can't just get a test on the internet. You have to get referred by your doctor. It means they're doing less tests, but they sort of have the public health infrastructure to back this up, which means they've had less of a spike than we have, as you've suggested, Dalia. If you just give people the money to self-isolate if they have symptoms, that's actually much more useful than testing everyone who has any kind of symptom whatsoever. We've got a kind of the system we have seems just somewhat irrational. And what Boris Johnson today announced in the press conference is that we're going to have this new other sort of technology which is going to come along and solve all of the problems. It's going to be a 15-minute test. We've already bought millions of them. And why I find this so frustrating is because how many times over the past 8 months have basically, public health experts and professionals are saying the thing you need to do is just help people self-isolate by giving them enough money. The thing you need to do is allow non-essential businesses to close and to replace their income. The thing you need to do is cough up a bit of cash and not give loads of money to your useless mates at Serco so that you can have a public health response to a public health crisis. And instead, the government are like, oh no, we don't like that idea. We don't like that idea either because it's against their ideology, because it's like, oh, local public health, public sector, oh, we don't like that. They're like, well, we'll pull a new invention out of the hat. And every time they pull a new invention out of the hat, yeah, it might sound nice in one press conference, but it doesn't usually come around. Maybe this will come around, I don't know. But it just seems so emblematic of this government that they're told the simple options. They say, oh no, we don't like that. And then they come up with some mad, potential, untested future technology. If you remember, the millions of antibody tests they're all going to have, it just feels like Groundhog Day.
Absolutely. And I think that that's because it's not about the money necessarily. It's not about, and, we know that, for example, this idea of it's going to rack up debt, governments have no problem racking up debt. That's not really how national economies work. This is not so much about the money. It's about the ideological departure. It's about this idea that people might just get used to having the right to survive and having access to the means of life without working 9-10-hour days. So, I think it's really that concept that the state can intervene in that way. And that, for example, that, you know, if workers need it, that they can stay at home or they can work from home, etc. So I really do think that this is a good example of showing the ideological slant towards this, and that's the only explanation, I think, for why the government, that and the fact that it is, you know, beneficial to their mates in the private sector, of why the government continues to a government that supposedly cares about, you know, not racking up debt and sort of like balancing the books and all of that, keeps on hemorrhaging money at potential technological fixes that may or may not exist and may or may not work, and often have a track record of not really working, rather than, as you say, taking those really simple public health measures that would be more effective, that we know work. But I think, as we sort of talked about last week, rub the British state up the wrong way, because it breaks that spell that people, that workers should be sustained even if they're not actively being exploited, if that makes sense.
We're going to get on to the vulture capitalists. We sort of referred to them a few times already, Serco, because whilst the current coronavirus situation isn't working for anyone, as Jeremy Farrar from Sage has said today, it's the worst of both possible, or the worst of every possible world we live in at the moment, where it's terrible for health, terrible for the economy, our sort of half-assed policy where nothing really works. But for a certain subset of people, the vulture capitalists, this situation is truly Panglossian. They're making enormous profits without actually having to do very much work, right? And this definitely applies to Serco, and particularly their shareholders. So if you don't already know, Serco are the company who are responsible for our failing test and trace system. And they have confirmed that this year their profits have exceeded all expectations. And they've also confirmed that this is going to be paid out in dividends, right? So you've got a company which, you know, the whole country can see, you're failing us. We're giving you £12 billion and you're failing us. And they're like, this is great. We've got all these profits. They're not going to invest that in improving the system. No, they're going to give it to their shareholders. It's not subtle. I want to go to some quotes from this article from the Daily Echo. They're writing up a press association article because it sort of summarizes just how purely evil this company is, and also everything that's wrong with the British state. So they write, bosses said this was an indication of our customers' satisfaction with the quality of work we have delivered as part of the £12 billion committed by the government to the system. The company added, we have also seen increases in the number of asylum seekers we are looking after on behalf of the Home Office, and our new prisoner escorting contract has been successfully mobilised. We have now secured an extension to the emergency measures agreement on the Caledonian sleepers to the end of the year. Now, I don't know about the Caledonian sleepers, but the fact that you sort of said our customers are really happy with our failing £12 billion test and trace system. Oh, and also there are more asylum seekers in our detention centres, and there are more prisoners to be escorted. I mean, it's so dystopian. Let's go on. So they write, it expects a trading profit before any one-off costs of between £160 million and £165 million, compared to previous estimates of £135 million to £150 million. Full year revenue is expected to be around £3.9 billion, up from £3.7 billion previously predicted. The announcement comes a day after NHS Test and Trace recorded its worst ever week for contact tracing as cases of coronavirus continue to rise. Dalia, I mean, if you were playing like evil bastard bingo, there were quite a lot of boxes ticked there, weren't there?
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the phrase look after asylum seekers, I nearly threw my laptop out of the window. So that would have been the end of my participation in this show. But, I mean, it's absolutely like revolting, obviously. But, you know, we all know that, you know, capitalists will never let a good crisis go to waste. And we've seen how the state has maneuvered, and capital have maneuvered their responses, not only to kind of protect the interests of big businesses, but to actually boost the interests of big business. And we see the classic traditional winners of these kind of crises, you know, Serco and these other kind of giant, particularly sort of, and they tend to be companies that are very heavily involved in migrant detention as well. And I don't think that is really that's not a coincidence. But I also think that we are seeing the acceleration of another kind of model of sort of Silicon Valley style capitalism. You know, we already know that tech massive tech companies like Amazon, Uber have all made significant gains out of the pandemic. And that basically means a massive scaling up of the kind of particular strategies of breaking worker power that they have been these companies have been incrementally imposing through various struggles with workers, with local governments over the past 10 years. And, this whole kind of thing of the touchless economy and the kind of you're not a worker, you're your own boss type. And, that's going to happen. That acceleration is happening for two reasons. It's happening because these kind of logistics companies are becoming increasingly important as, we rely more on delivery, people are trying not to get public transport, so maybe more likely to opt for an Uber. But it's also happening because as people lose their jobs, as people, don't stop having access to formalized work, and are not supported by a proper furlough scheme, more and more people are going to be pushed into the hands of the exploitative work model that is offered by a lot of these tech companies. Whilst a lot of these measures no touch economy, like an economy where infrastructural workers are pushed to their limit and working really unsocial hours while being kind of invisible in our cities might seem like kind of rational responses to a pandemic now, I think that these kind of big businesses, these big tech monopolies, are going to find ways to fix these responses in time and find a way to never really get rid of that, and particularly of the kind of monopolistic power that they've accrued in this moment. And the particular characteristics of digital economy work is I think something that's going to gain a lot more kind of traction and is going to become a lot more commonplace and scaled up throughout the workforce, which is bad news for all workers, really.
Oh, I feel bad now for the person who was saying, make me smile this hour. We are going to move on in a moment to the other pointless battle that Boris Johnson has picked, this time with the European Union. Before we do that, if you're new to the show, please do hit the subscribe button and make sure you turn on notifications. This show goes live every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 7 p.m. The Bastani Factor. Actually, no, Ash sometimes does it now. So we got big interviews on Tuesday evenings. I'm not sure if it's got a title yet. Maybe you could suggest those in the comments. And then often the reason you want to be subscribed and get those notifications is because when there's a big political event, a big speech, a big controversy, we sometimes do impromptu live shows. Before we go on, thank you, Taranat Amadi Parker, for your £10 super chat. Very kind. Much appreciated. At the start of September, Boris Johnson said that if no deal had been reached by the EU summit on the 15th of October, Britain would leave the negotiations and prepare for no deal. Now, that deadline passed. The 15th of October was yesterday. We still haven't walked away from the negotiations. So it's another threat that the government hasn't quite followed through on. But Johnson today did ramp up the no deal rhetoric. Let's take a look.
From the outset, we were totally clear that we wanted nothing more complicated than a Canada-style relationship based on friendship and free trade. To judge by the latest EU summit in Brussels, that won't work for our EU partners. They want the continued ability to control our legislative freedom, our fisheries, in a way that is completely unacceptable to an independent country. And since we have only 10 weeks until the end of the transition period on January the 1st, I have to make a judgment about the likely outcome and to get us all ready. And given that they have refused to negotiate seriously for much of the last few months, and given that this summit appears explicitly to rule out a Canada-style deal, I've concluded that we should get ready for January the 1st with arrangements that are more like Australia's, based on simple principles of global free trade. And we can do it because we always knew that there would be change on January the 1st, whatever type of relationship we had. And so now is the time for our businesses to get ready and for our hauliers to get ready, for travellers to get ready. And of course, we're willing to discuss the practicalities with our friends, where a lot of progress has already been made, by the way, on such issues as social security and aviation, nuclear cooperation, and so on. But for whatever reason, it's clear from the summit that after 45 years of membership, they are not willing unless there's some fundamental change of approach to offer this country the same terms as Canada. And so with high hearts and with complete confidence, we will prepare to embrace the alternative, and we will prosper mightily as an independent, free trading nation, controlling our own borders, our fisheries, and setting our own laws. And in the meantime, the government will, of course, be focusing on tackling COVID and building back better so that 2021 is a year of recovery and renewal.
There's a big problem there, right, which he says, in the meantime, obviously the government will be focusing on coronavirus. And the government only has so much bandwidth. And it seems, as we've talked about so many times on the show, the government doesn't seem to have that much bandwidth. It's sort of creaking at the seams when it comes to responding to this pandemic, which would be difficult for any government, let alone our government, which has been completely ripped of any state capacity by 40 years of neoliberalism. It can only, the only thing it can think to do is hand £12 billion to a corporation to run a test and trace system that doesn't work. They're trying to now claim to us, we can both plan for a no-deal Brexit and, clean up this mess that we've made when it comes to this pandemic. It just seems ridiculous and irresponsible to me. And I don't say that as someone who's like, we need to remain, or even that, I don't care that much about what Brexit deal we end up with. I just want our government to be doing their job at the moment, which is saving people's lives when it comes to coronavirus, not being distracted with some row about fish with Emmanuel Macron. I mean, it just seems like the priorities are all wrong. And I introduced the word there, no deal Brexit. Obviously, Boris Johnson didn't talk about a no-deal Brexit. He talked about an Australian-style arrangement. But an Australian-style arrangement is a no-deal Brexit. So Australia doesn't have any trade deal with the European Union. It has a few sort of bespoke deals here and there, but it doesn't have a comprehensive trade deal. And fundamentally, that just means walking away with no deal. The reason the European Union don't want to give us a Canada-style deal is because we're much closer. Geography is often a key that's been missing when it comes to debates about what kind of deal we might want with the European Union. I'm going to go to you in one moment, Dalia. First, though, this is a response, actually. So this is Boris Johnson trying to say he's playing hardball, but actually he might just be sort of covering his back because the European Union leaders did that yesterday. So EU leaders last night told the UK negotiators that we should walk away, so Britain should walk away if we are unable to offer concessions on fishing. And this is especially important to Macron because of French fishermen who, presume, fish quite a lot in British waters. So at the summit yesterday, Macron said, under no condition can our fishermen be sacrificed during Brexit. If conditions aren't met, it's possible we don't have an agreement. We are ready for that. If there are no good terms found at the end of the discussion, we are ready for a no deal. Mark Rutte, so he's the Dutch Prime Minister, also said Britain has already imposed so many deadlines that came and went. So, I mean, this is tough talk from all sides, isn't it? I don't know if I find anyone particularly likable in this debate, but it does seem slightly ridiculous to me that in the middle of a global pandemic, we're about to enter an extremely, economically and politically disruptive situation, which no one seems to be denying us leaving on no deal would be on the 31st of December, all over some fish.
Slightly less bad than 2020, and I have to say that this story makes me cling on to that more, because when you look at the objective reality, it seems that is not likely to be the case if Boris Johnson is doing more than just sort of bluffing, which is sort of how he's kind of, it's the thing that he's best at. It's the thing he's best at, and it's the thing that he likes about the job. He doesn't like the kind of nitty gritty of saving people's lives. He likes the kind of this sort of poker game being played with the EU. It's also really savvy marketing from him to call what is crashing out of the EU an Australian style Brexit, because I feel like anytime you describe something as Australian style, British people love it. I don't know why, but Australia is like a country I'm never going to go to. It's settler colonialism and bugs, which are two things I really don't like. But it's the unfortunate reality here. Well, first of all, calling it the Australia style Brexit is like giving it an air of legitimacy as if this could somehow work. Whereas, first of all, Australia does not rely on the EU in the way that Britain does because of, as you mentioned, that thing known as geography. But also, Australia didn't spend like several decades building its economy around a particular agreement and then out of nowhere crash out of it. It kind of built its economy around particular conditions that it is still existing in. That's very, very different. But the unfortunate reality here is that the EU hold most of the chips. And that's not something that you can change with sort of Boris Johnson's particular style of, patriotic bloviating. The EU is a neoliberal trading bloc. It can be pretty fucking brutal if it needs to be and if it wants to be. And it looks like they're increasingly going in that position. And I think that's what looks so scary to me. As someone who, is neither particularly passionate about either leaving or remaining in the EU and kind of thinks that both campaigns were a fucking disaster, what's scary to me is that I'm looking at a British state and the EU, which both seem highly unconcerned with the material impacts that this is going to have, particularly on working class Brits. And this, comes straight off the back of the fact that the issue with Ireland is still not resolved, which, was something that we was discussed last week. But yeah, it seems the thing that scares me is that the EU has the majority of the chips in this situation. And that seems to be something that Boris Johnson thinks he can bluff his way out of. But unfortunately, that is not going to be the case. But I do think that this is, again, a return to that sort of really irritating sort of big boy talk from both the EU and Britain. And sometimes it can be easy to get caught up in that and not realize that actually what ends up happening is hopefully going to be slightly less dramatic.
We're going to go to our final story in one moment. First of all, thank you, Alison Barber, for a tenner super chat. Much appreciated. Keep your tweets and comments coming. We'll read them at the end of the show because this is going to be our final section. Keir Starmer suffered his biggest rebellion in Parliament since becoming Labour leader when 35 of his MPs broke the whip to vote against the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill, otherwise known as the Spycops Bill. So Labour had whipped for MPs to abstain on the bill, which would give law-breaking by undercover agents a basis in law, but which has been criticised for offering few safeguards for victims of state abuse. We'll talk about the details of it a bit more later. But MPs who resigned from the front bench, there's a big rebellion, to vote against the bill included Shadow Education Minister Margaret Greenwood, Parliamentary Private Secretaries Nav Mishra, Kim Johnson, Mary Foy, Rachel Hopkins and Sarah Owens, and Shadow Treasury Minister Dan Carden. And we can take a look at Carden's speech in Parliament explaining his decision.
The bill paves the way for gross abuses of state power against citizens. And in Liverpool, we have a healthy suspicion of state power, because we've felt its damaging force too often in the past. We've experienced the 30-year fight of the Hillsborough families and survivors for truth and justice. We've had striking workers targeted by state violence, trade unionists blacklisted and spied on for representing their members. And we're not alone. Campaigners fighting miscarriages of justice across our country, like Orgreave, like the Shrewsbury 24, and now Grenfell Tower, they oppose this dangerous bill. And I fear my own party is being taken for a ride by this government. Because I tell you what happens. You start with the idea that legislating for something that operates in the shadows must be a good thing. You then engage in good faith with a morally bankrupt government arguing for vital safeguards. And once that government finishes stringing you along, you end up in the perverse situation of condoning laws that ride a coach and horses through our nation's civil liberties, and could even be used against the Labour movement itself.
That was a brilliant speech by Dan Carden, talking about how Labour here, by sort of trying to play smart politics by saying we're going to do constructive opposition, we're not going to oppose the government, have ended up basically just backing anything the government do. So the Labour Party were saying, we're going to vote for this on the second reading because we want to put forward some amendments. Then it gets to the third reading and they're like, none of our amendments have passed. We'll still abstain anyway. It's too clever by half, and it ends up making the Labour Party just onlookers as a really reactionary law gets passed. And it is worth sort of reiterating what is wrong with this law, because, the front bench are kind of correct that sometimes you will have to have agents of the state break laws in some situations. So, for example, if you are spying on a terrorist cell, then you might have to take part in planning a terrorist act to, get in with that cell. That's illegal. But obviously that person who is an undercover agent who's trying to stop that terrorist attack should not go to prison for planning a terrorist attack they were only ever planning to foil. You get what I mean, right? So it makes sense that this should be brought above board. Before, it was all sort of informal, and this law makes it official. But the problem is that if you were going to do that, if you were going to give agents of the state basically immunity to break particular laws, you need to have some proper safeguards in place. You need to have external agencies deciding when an agent of the state can and cannot break the law, ideally a judge. But this law, as it's been passed by the Conservatives, means that if the Met Police want to have a cop break the law, then it's the Met Police who get to decide. That's not, no one would argue that's a good form of accountability. They also place no limits on what kind of law can be broken. So in Canada and the United States, they have a law of this type, but it limits what agents of the state can do. It says, it can't be torture, it can't be murder. It might say it can't be rape. It should do. It should have done in Britain, but I'm not 100% sure actually what's in the Canadian one. And no limits are in this bill, which has just been passed by Parliament. And Dalia, I want to bring you in on this. It does seem, one, morally abject. The Labour Party just abstained on this. But also, I don't know what you think, whether Keir Starmer will be celebrating the fact that 7 people, I think 6 of them were in the Socialist campaign group, so the left-wingers of the party, have resigned from the front bench. He might think this is just a helpful clearing of them out. Or do you think he might think he misstepped here?
I can't get into the head of Keir Starmer. I don't think he particularly cares. I think that this whole principle of what is it that he says, not opposition for opposition's sake, that to me makes no political sense. So again, I can't really see a logic in which this is situated. I think that he maybe this is just his politics, and that really sucks. But this bill is absolutely shameful, and what frustrates me about it is that our newspaper columns, TV shows, panels, there's an endless amount of ink and words spilled over questions of freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of political thought, dissent, all of this. But it's only ever spoken about in reference to, crusty old snowflakes whinging because they have to use a different pronoun to the one that they thought they should use, or, someone not having their column at, a broadsheet paper because they won't stop being a dick to black people. It's just like this idea that this is where we need to have these really serious conversations about freedom of speech, when really the essence of freedom of speech as a principle is about the very thing that this bill is attacking, which is the freedom to dissent, the freedom to express, the freedom of political association, without the threat of being punished by the state. And that is what the Spycops saga was about. It was about people being punished by the state for raising concern, for organizing around things like climate justice, for organizing around animal rights, for organizing around police brutality. Women often talk about how, things like when undercover cops would establish relationships and have children with activists while undercover. They often frame it as being raped by the state. And I think that idea of actually the severity of how it is a punishment and how it is an act of violence, as a consequence of doing organizing that is part of a democratic society. It's absolutely foul. And I think that in terms of disempowering and I think demobilizing the Socialist campaign group and Labour Party members who are probably only there because of the Socialist campaign group, I think that's more what Keir Starmer is interested in doing. I think he's more interested in sort of crushing the last element of that spirit of Corbynism and sort of making exhausting and debilitating its base as part of the Labour Party membership. I don't think the actual material or stuff of the bill is of his concern, quite frankly.
I want to go to what was the sort of official defence of abstaining on this bill, which is represented in a piece that Conor McGinn, who is Labour's shadow security minister, wrote for Labour List. And this is sort of an explanation of the front bench decision. So he writes, the CHIS bill So the Spycops bill addresses a vital issue, the need to provide a clear, lawful framework for the use of human intelligence sources who often help undercover crimes such as far-right terrorism and child sexual exploitation. Any responsible government acting in the national interest would need to legislate to address this. The current status quo is unacceptable, as it means this happens without proper oversight and the formal protections offered by the Human Rights Act. Without this legislation, undercover sources will either be unable to operate, depriving our security services of a vital tool in disrupting terrorism and serious and organised crime, or continue to do so only by operating in the shadows. Neither outcome is in the national interest. Both are worse than this bill passing. You can see there that the Labour front bench is already doing the government's game by putting in your mind, when you're thinking about this bill, things that everyone think is wrong. No one has that much concern when someone is, planting themselves in a child sexual exploitation ring, how much accountability they have, right? It's when you put in the minds of the public trade unionists and climate activists where people are like, yeah, you probably do need some accountability here. So the front bench already doing the government's work. I want to go on though, because this is the bit that I find particularly weird. So Conor McGinn writes, there have been concerns raised about the potential for this bill to interfere with the campaigns against burning injustices such as the Spycops scandal, the appalling events at and surrounding Orgreave, the abuse and secrecy around the Camel-led shipyard workers, and the Shrewsbury 24, and collusion on blacklisting. That is why we have been pressing the government to be explicit in stating that this bill is in no way retrospective and cannot legally impede these campaigns for justice. Now, what I see is really weird for this. It's also kind of pathetic because it's like we've been pressing the government. The government haven't even conceded this. But the fact that this is a priority for the Labour Party to say this cannot be done retrospectively to deny the people who have been subject to past injustices the right to, justice, essentially. Why, if they're worried that it's going to prevent people in the past seeking justice, are they not worried about people in the future seeking redress for injustices by the state? If they believe that this law would undermine the ability of the people who suffered, as Dalia's put it, sort of raped by the state in the Spycops scandal, then why wouldn't it, also hinder the ability of people in future to seek and achieve redress for those kind of crimes? Now, I just don't understand this. I mean, there's a couple of ways of looking at it, I suppose. One is to have this sort of weird, naive thing that, the state might have done it 9 years. Spycops was not a long time ago. It was about a decade ago. So you can say, Orgreave, the state's changed so much since the 80s. I'm not sure how much it has, but at least it's be a plausible argument. But one of your examples is from 10 years ago, and you say, it doesn't matter if we inhibit the ability of people to seek redress because this is the kind of thing that happened in the past. I mean, it just seems bizarrely naive. The other option is that the Labour Party under Keir Starmer know that they only ever support movements when they're in the past. So you see Black Lives Matter. We're not that sure about Black Lives Matter, but something that happened 40 years ago that maybe broke the law. It's like, yes, we're in favour of the miners' strike now. We weren't at the time. I mean, that's very much the idea. Dalia, I want your thoughts on this, I think, quite pathetic official justification for abstaining on the Spycops bill.
Yeah, I think that's actually such a good point about how, not only is it about it, I think in many ways it's not the right way to think of this as like a concession. I think that, for a lot of these kind of extra parliamentary groups, climate justice groups, police brutality groups, anti-racist groups, migrant justice groups, these are all the groups that hold the Labour Party's, trade unions are all the groups that hold the Labour Party's feet to the fire, that hold Labour MPs to particular standards that I'm sure that a lot of Labour MPs find very pesky and annoying and don't really, aren't. And we saw this with Corbynism, that, a lot of the kind of the response of the centrists was like, these are just, kind of like crazy campaigners or crazy activists. This isn't a social movement. It's a party. And it's like, maybe you would have won a few elections if you allowed it to become more of a social movement. But I really think that you are right in that kind of like only supporting these kinds of extra parliamentary campaigns when they're in the past is a perfect summary. And, this idea that it's not going to be retroactive, it's going to allow for past injustices to still be taken to court, etc. And this idea that the state will never repeat these kinds of practices again. It's like, I actually don't believe that you're that historically illiterate I actually refuse to believe that, because then I just can't even bother. I can't even engage with it anymore. So we have to, it is really that kind of just attempting to cover their backs, because this is not something they want to kick a stink up about.
I totally agree. We're going to end there. Before we do, a couple of comments. So Mark Lungley tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. If a bill is morally good, not to I get if a bill is morally good not to oppose it, but the Spycops bill is morally wrong, and the chorus of revulsion must be loud and clear from the unions and UK Labour members. Agree, Mark Lungley. And to be honest, I think actually the unions did put up a really good fight here, and that's probably why the rebellion was as big as it was. And Baz Cams with a fiver, Tories out as ever. Hard to disagree with that particular statement. We'd all be much safer if they were. Dalia, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you this evening. Always a wonderful way to top off the week. And thank you for watching Tysky Sour this evening. If you have enjoyed the show, do hit the like button. It helps us on the algorithm and with our collective self-esteem. We'll be back on Monday evening, either from the studio or my room. I'm not quite sure yet. We'll see how this story develops. But between now and then, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.